halfway through the class for this semester. So I'm so glad you could join me today. I know it's been a fall break. I hope you've enjoyed some of the time off. The weather's been kind of nice, so it's been good. Now, just before we get started, I want to remind everybody this morning that you're probably going to need some paper and pencil. So if you can find some paper and pencil, we're going to need it for the last part of class because we're going to try another writing activity today. Okay, well guys, today is a big day because we have to cover some pretty important events here in American history. So today we kind of focus on the history part. So again, we talked about the government, finished the government discussion last week. Of course, we'll come back and review some things. But this week, we've got some important historical information. So again, today we're looking at specifically the 1800s. So this is the time in the United States history after the American Revolution, after the war with England, when America was becoming a country. And then, of course, in the middle of the 1800s, we had the Civil War, which we're going to spend a lot of time talking about here today, because again, this was a very important moment, a very important time in American history. So let's go ahead and begin. So we have lots of history to cover today. So I'm going to zoom in a little bit and kind of get started. Now, once again, I will probably ask you to help me a little bit, but I'll start with the lesson here. So again, one of the questions, actually there are two questions in the citizenship interview about wars. So for example, the first one we're going to talk about are the wars in the 1800s that we had in the United States. And then next week, we're going to talk about the wars that we've had in the 1900s. So here in the United States, in our history, in the 1800s, we actually had four wars. So let's take a look at each one just very quickly. First off, a very interesting and often forgotten war is the War of 1812. Now, the War of 1812 was another war between the United States and Great Britain and England. In fact, some people call the War of 1812 the Second American Revolution. In fact, during the War of 1812, the British were able to burn the White House. So keep in mind that, America, this particular war was not an easy one. I think most people forget this war because America won the war. But if you talk to most Americans, they won't remember much about the War of 1812. It was very short. And like I said, the United States did win, but it was not quite as well known as the American Revolution. Now, first off, the War of 1812 was about 3 years, 1812 to 1815. But a very important result came from the war, and that is our national song. So if you notice this picture here, now again, this is not a photograph, all right? We didn't have cameras in 1812. This is a painting. So this painting is not 100% true. But the person that you see here, I'll highlight here with my pointer, this here is Francis Scott Key. Francis Scott Key. Now, I won't give you much about the history of this situation, but Francis Scott Key was on this ship here in the harbor in Baltimore, and he was looking over at this fort, the fort that you see here. It's, again, not too easy to see there, but the name of the fort is called Fort McHenry. Now, you notice here in Kentucky, we have places called Fort Mitchell, right? Have you noticed that? Fort Mitchell, Fort Thomas. You guys notice those here in Northern Kentucky?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Adam.
Yeah, so the reason why we have these forts are actually because of the Civil War. So I'll talk about that in just a moment. But here, Fort McHenry is located in Baltimore, Maryland, which is actually very close to Washington, D.C. And actually, guys, you can visit Fort McHenry today. I visited Fort McHenry about 15, 20 years ago, and it's a really interesting place. But again, the basic idea is the British were attacking. So they were shooting bombs, they were firing from their ships onto the fort. Now, Francis Scott Key, he was a lawyer, and he was on a British ship because he was trying to help get two American prisoners freed, or he was trying to get some American prisoners freed, but instead they kept him on the boat. Okay, so anyway, so the British were firing bombs at the fort, but what happened was the next morning. This is the story. Okay, so we think it's true, but this is the story that Francis Scott Key the next morning he saw the flag still there after all of the bombs had been firing at the fort. Now, in just a few minutes, we're going to listen to our national song, and you will notice in the song it talks about the story of how the bombs were attacking this place, and then the flag was still there. The flag did not fall. Now, the name of this song is called the Star Spangled Banner. Okay, so everyone, we're going to say that together. So are we ready? Oops, we don't want to clear it completely. There we go. Sorry, guys. I just want to erase this part so we can see the name. All right, so everybody, let's say this word together. Let's say the name of the song together. Ready? So let's say it. Star Spangled Banner. Everybody.
The Star
Star Spangled Banner. Now, you might say, Mr. John, what does Star Spangled Banner mean? Well, the word banner is just another word for flag. Okay. And then Star Spangled, spangled just means many, many stars. So again, now keep in mind, this is not the flag of today. Okay, so you know our flag has 50 stars today, but in 1812 they didn't have 50 stars. So the idea here is there are many stars on the flag, but not 50. But anyway, that's the name of our national song. Now everyone, we're going to say another word together. Let's say this word together, anthem. Everyone, let's say that. Ready?
Anthem.
Anthem. Yeah, so anthem is just another word for song, especially like the song of your country, okay? Now, I'm curious, guys, before we continue, do you know your national anthem? Can you sing your national anthem? Elena, what's the name of the national anthem of your country?
I don't know in English.
Well, tell us in your language. Tell us in your language.
Ще не вмерла Україна.
So, do you know how to sing it?
No. No.
Okay, I know this is not American Idol, so it's okay, Elena. You don't have to sing the song. That's okay. Sometimes my students love to sing, though. I had one student many years ago who sang the whole national anthem of their song. It took like 6 minutes. We had to sit and listen. So don't worry, I'm not going to make you sing. Saba, what about your country? What's the name of your national anthem? Do you know?
Yes, but in English it
means... Tell us in your language. Tell us in your language.
إن منبت الأحرار منتدى الأنوار. It takes a long time.
Long time, yeah. Well,
but it's about liberty and freedom from colonies.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, a lot of national anthems are kind of like that. Okay.
Yeah.
Elaine, what about your country? Do you know the national anthem of your country?
I'm so sorry. It's very confused for me because in Hong Kong and before it's British. Okay?
It's British, right? God Save the Queen, right?
But now it's China. I still don't know how to say that. Sorry.
Well, Elaine, it's very interesting. I think, Elaine, to be honest, I think you might be maybe the first or second student I've had from Hong Kong. I've not had that many from Hong Kong, so that's interesting to know that, yeah, I was British before. Yeah. So, do you remember any of the British one?
Let me think about that. Because, yeah, every night the TV before close, they have I really don't know.
Well, the good news is we have YouTube, right? We can go watch it. Well, anyway, don't worry, guys. I'm not going to sing the American national anthem, but we are going to listen to it here in just a moment. And I'm sure...
John,
go ahead, Elaine. Yeah.
But, John, I know that is old
Oh, you know some of the American one. Okay. Well, don't worry, Elaine. We'll let you sing it here in just a moment. Okay. We'll let you sing the
Oh, say, yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, anyway, usually I like to ask the question if students know the national anthem of their own country. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't, and sometimes when they do, they sing it. Now, what's interesting is before later we're going to watch the national anthem and listen to it, but actually it's interesting, Saba, the American national anthem is actually very, very long, but most people only sing the first verse, the first part. So if you wanted to sing the American national anthem, like the full song, it would take a very long time. It's also a very difficult song to sing, so you will hear that's why I'm not going to sing it. I'm going to find somebody else who's better. Okay, well, guys, anyway, let's come back for just a moment. So that first war that we're talking about is the War of 1812. Okay, the War of 1812. And again, it was the United States and Great Britain. And of course, the most important thing we remember today from it is our national anthem. So again, the national anthem is the Star Spangled Banner. And that is a question that you'll hear in the interview. Okay, now another war that many Americans really don't remember, but I can tell you some of my students from Mexico certainly remember this. The next war we're going to look at very quickly is called the Mexican-American War. Now, the Mexican-American War was a war fought between the United States and Mexico. Now, if you notice, it was about 30 years later than the War of 1812. And basically, this particular war was on the border between our territories at the time. So, for example, just before this war, Texas had become a state. So Texas was kind of on the border. So Texas was part of Mexico, but it eventually became part of the United States. But Texas was not part of the war of the Mexican-American War in terms of land. Okay, because Texas was already part of the United States, but Texas in the past, the United States and Mexico had fought in Texas for many years. So again, this was becoming a problem. Now, keep in mind, at the time, many people in Mexico, they were not under the Spanish rule by the 1840s. They actually were part of the French Empire. So in this case, it was kind of between the United States and Mexico, but also supported by the French in this case. Okay, so anyway, that's kind of complicated. But basically, what happened is that the United States, when they won the war, they received lots of the land that was originally belonging to Mexico, which again originally was part of the Spanish Empire and eventually became part of the United States. So for example, when we think of this war today, these particular parts of the United States came from that war. So for example, California, Nevada, Utah, New Mexico, Arizona. Remember, we talked about those states many weeks ago. These were the border states, right, between the United States and Mexico. So keep in mind, even New Mexico there, right? Notice how it says New Mexico. This was territory that the United States gained. So it actually added to the size of the United States. So once again, another war that was fought was the Mexican-American War. And again, the war was really just for a couple of years, 1846 to 1848. Okay, let's continue. Now again, remember, during the interview, we're only just thinking about the names of these wars, okay? So you'll see why in just a few minutes. Now, the Civil War is a war we're going to talk about in more detail in just a few minutes. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the Civil War, but I will mention that it was the biggest war that the United States has ever fought. And it was the only war that we fought in our own land between each other. Now, some of you, again, some of my students come from countries where different territories, different peoples are fighting against each other. For example, Elaine from Hong Kong, Hong Kong was originally part of China, then became part of the British Empire. So in this case, and again, Saba being a French colony, so some of you know what happens when you have these different populations and different groups who have different ideas and different cultures. So again, the Civil War is one we're going to talk about in more detail in just a moment. So again, the Civil War was from 1861 to 1865. Okay, now we'll talk more about that in just a moment. But one holiday that you may know is Memorial Day, right? Memorial Day, which is in May. And Memorial Day is a day when we honor those people who died. Now, originally, the holiday was created to commemorate those who died in the Civil War. But then later, the day changed, and now it's for all soldiers who fought during wars. So that's why we have Memorial Day. Now, some of you might, think of Memorial Day as a day that we usually start summer, right? We go to the beach or we eat hot dogs and things like that. But actually, the importance of the day is to remember those who died in the wars. Okay? Now, we're going to talk about the Civil War in more detail in just a moment. Now, right at the end of the 1800s, the final war we're going to talk about, just really briefly, is what's called the Spanish-American War. The Spanish-American War. Now, some of you might remember. Do you remember a few weeks ago when we talked about territories? Remember we talked about Puerto Rico, for example? Do you remember that?
Yeah.
You might remember Guam. We mentioned Guam as well. Well, the
Yeah.
reason why the United States has some of these, stranger kind of territories outside of the country is because of this war, the Spanish-American War. Now, the Spanish-American War was very short, but it was fought between the United States and the Empire of Spain. Now, Spain at this time also occupied Cuba. So the United States actually helped to, I guess, liberate Cuba as well. So again, Cuba, Puerto Rico, all of these places very close. But anyway, that's why we have Puerto Rico and Guam as part of the United States. So, and of course, the Virgin Islands, the U.S. Virgin Islands as well. And today, that's why we think of Puerto Rico, Guam, all became part of the United States as territories, not as states, but as territories. Now, it's possible that Puerto Rico might actually choose to become a state. Every few years, there's a vote in Puerto Rico if they want to become a state, and usually that's not become true. It's not happened, but it might change. You never know. And then, of course, here's a painting that we see here from the battle in Manila. So in this case, again, the United States went to go fight in Cuba and Puerto Rico in these particular wars as well. And some of you might know one of our most well-known presidents, Theodore Roosevelt. He fought in the Spanish-American War, and then he eventually became president. Okay, now guys, those are the four wars that occurred during the 1800s. So again, the War of 1812, right? The Mexican-American War, the Civil War, and the Spanish-American War. So as you can see, during this time, these particular wars kind of show you how the United States was beginning to grow in territory. It was beginning to grow in land and getting bigger and bigger. Now, of course, as the United States continued to get bigger and bigger, we obviously had lots of problems in that situation. So let's go back for just a moment to our presentation. Now, speaking of growing, let's talk for just a moment about one more important historical event. And actually, this occurred at the beginning of the 1800s. Now, some of you might remember Thomas Jefferson, right? Remember Thomas Jefferson? So he was one of our presidents, right? Remember, Saba? Yeah, so remember, so Thomas Jefferson, most of you remember, hopefully you remember, that he wrote the Declaration of Independence. Now, Jefferson also became president. He was the third president of the United States. But let's read a little bit about his history. So, Saba, would you do me a favor and read what's on the screen here for us?
Uh, 20 years after the end of the American War of Independence in 1783, President Thomas Jefferson, the author of the Declaration of Independence, had an opportunity. In 1903, Napoleon, the Emperor of France, sold the land in the middle of the country to Jefferson, which helped double to size of the United States.
Okay, very good. Now, Saba, let's try that date one more time. So,
date?
Yeah, can you read it one more time? Because I think we said the wrong date.
Okay, the Louisiana purchase of 19.
Not 19.
1903.
No, not 19.
19.
No.
Oh.
18.
18.
Sorry. 18. I'm sorry.
That's 18, 19. That's a big difference here, Saba. That's 100 years of a difference.
Yeah. I'm sorry.
Okay. Yeah, so it's 1803.
18.
Now,
Yeah.
now keep in mind, in 1803, the country was still very young. So again, one of the questions in the interview is going to mention this important purchase. So everyone, let's say the name of this purchase. Okay, so everyone, let's say it together. Ready? The Louisiana Purchase. Everyone, let's say it. Ready? The
The
The Louisiana
Louisiana
Purchase.
Purchase.
Yes. Purchase.
Yeah, by the way, what does purchase mean? Does anybody know what purchase means?
To buy.
Yeah. So notice we call it the Louisiana Purchase, not the Louisiana Buy, right? We go to the store to buy things. The word purchase is like when you buy really big things, right? Now, of course, ladies, when you tell your husbands if you've made a purchase, that's why your husbands get nervous. Because if you say, I purchased something, uh-oh, that's big. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's really big, right? Okay. Of course, your husbands do it too, right? Your husbands say, honey, don't look at the credit card. Don't look at the bank. Okay. Well, anyway, let's take a look at that Louisiana Purchase. Now, some of you might know that Louisiana today is a state. The Louisiana state is actually located here next to Florida and Mississippi and Alabama. But remember, in the early 1800s, the United States was still kind of a baby of a country. In fact, look at the map here on the screen. If you look at the map, you will see, excuse me, some of the same states that were the original 13 states. Remember some of those original 13 states? Now, for example, here in 1803, if you'll notice, we've added some states. For example, notice Vermont is now a state in 1803. We mentioned Kentucky. Remember, Kentucky was number 15. So we had the 13 original states, right? Massachusetts, Rhode Island. But then we added more states as the country continued to grow. For example, we have Maine, right? There's Maine there at the top. Ohio finally became a state. In fact, 1803 was the year that Ohio became a state. So 2003, I don't think anybody was living here in 2003. That was a big anniversary for people living here because that was the 200th anniversary. Notice Indiana. Indiana is not a state at this time. It's called a territory. In fact, many of the places here in the Midwest and West were still what we call territories. So in other words, they were not part of the government necessarily, specifically. They didn't have representation. Now, if you look here in the middle of the screen, now, again, remember, at this time, basically this part of the world was divided between the Spanish and the French. And eventually the French took over some of the Spanish territory in Mexico. And then we had the British territory up here. In fact, the French had a little bit of territory here in northern Canada. Not much. Remember, that used to be French, and then the British, made the French people leave. And actually, many of those French people moved to Louisiana, to this territory, and some stayed. So Saba, you might remember we talked about why some Canadians speak French. Well, it's because some of those French people stayed. Some of those French people still lived up here. But remember, part of Canada was used to be the part of the French territory. Okay, well, anyway, enough history. But if you notice here, this middle part of the country, this is the purchase that the United States made from France. So that's why we call it Louisiana, because it's French, right? King Louis. That's the original, right, king that we're thinking of. So in this case, if you can see, it almost doubled the size of the country. So here's what the United States looked like in 1803, and then after they bought this land, right? Now keep in mind, guys, let's be clear. There were many Native Americans living in this part of the United States. Many of the colonists have pushed a lot of the Native Americans out, and many of them started moving in this direction. But really, in this part of the world, in the Louisiana Purchase, not many people lived there. So in fact, in 1803, 1804, President Jefferson sent two people to go explore this part of the world. Yeah, so their names are Lewis and Clark. I'll put them in the chat box in case you're interested. I really love reading about these two men, Lewis and Clark. It's one of my favorite stories in history. But basically, Lewis and Clark, Lewis came down from Pennsylvania through Ohio and into Kentucky. He was on a boat. And then basically he met Clark in Louisville, and the two men went out and explored this territory, this Louisiana territory. So after Jefferson bought it, they explored it, and then they went all the way to the coast, all the way here to Oregon, and they came all the way back. It took them 2 years to do it. Remember, no trains, no planes. And here's the amazing thing: in their party, in their group of people, only one person died. Only one. So that was an amazing journey, amazing trip that they made. They went up the Mississippi, across the Missouri, all the way across these different rivers, and they saw the Pacific Ocean. So anyway, it's a very interesting story. I would recommend, if you're interested, to read a little bit more about them. Okay, well, anyway, go ahead, Saba.
Is it like a cowboy?
Like, say it again.
A cowboy. They think America made a lot of movie cowboy.
Oh, you cowboys. Oh, okay.
Cowboys.
This
yeah.
this was long before cowboys. We might consider them to be pioneers. So this was kind of before cowboys started moving into this territory. Saba, we think of cowboys as more like 1870s, 1880s. Yeah, that's much more of that time period, especially because we didn't have many of these territories until the 1840s and 50s. So probably that's when cowboys kind of began. But in this case, we would call them pioneers, or probably more accurately, we would call them explorers.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, they were kind of like Columbus, Christopher Columbus or people like that. Yeah.
Yes.
So Lewis and Clark were kind of more explorers. Okay, well, guys, I could talk about Lewis and Clark all day, but we got to continue. Okay. All right. Now, remember the national anthem? Well, here it is. So, guys, what we're going to do is we're going to listen to it. And what I did is I put the words over here on the right side. Now, I apologize if your internet connection might be slow, but I'm going to play this video. It's very short. It's about 2 minutes. This is Whitney Houston. Some of you might remember Whitney Houston. She was a really great American singer, right,
Yes.
Elaine? Remember?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. Well, I've got news for you. She's a better singer than I am. Okay, that may be a surprise, but she's a better singer. So I'm going to let her sing the national anthem instead of me. And if you want, you can try to follow the words here on the screen. Now, if you notice the words, many of them talk about those bombs attacking the fort, and how the Star-Spangled Banner, the flag, was still there, waving like this in the air. Okay, so let's just listen. It's going to take about 2 minutes. So guys, you turn off your mics for a moment. Let's just listen. Okay, so yeah, let's turn off our microphones. Okay, good. So let's see if we can listen. Okay, so here we go. Okay, do you think I made a good choice?
Yeah, it's a little bit. It's a little bit hard to sing it with the music.
It's a very difficult song to sing.
Yeah.
So
Is it I missed
That's
something?
why.
say it again, Lane.
Is it I missed something? I cannot hear anything now. No, before.
I turned on the sound. I don't know. Can you hear it now? Can you hear me?
Yeah, but is it the song is? I cannot hear the song.
Okay, well, it's possible that I switched it over to make sure you could hear the sound. So it's possible it might be a connection issue. Don't worry, Elaine. I'll send it to you. You can watch it later. It's okay. Well, anyway, because again, yeah, it's probably better I don't sing it. But anyway, there's the national anthem, and Saba, just to let you know, this song is very long. It goes on and on and on. So this is actually just the first. This is just the first verse of the song.
I heard it every competition in swimming competition.
Absolutely, sports.
But, yeah, sports. But twice time I heard one woman. She's a little bit. I think 60 years old, and she can sing it.
Well, it takes a really good singer to make it sound good.
Yeah.
So that's my opinion. So. Okay. Well, anyway, guys, let's go ahead and answer a couple of questions before we continue. So once again, remember we mentioned there were 4 wars in the 1800s. Can you name one of the wars? Who can tell me one of the wars?
Civil War?
Civil War,
War and
Spanish.
Spanish War with
American
Oh,
War
you're close.
and
Spanish.
Mexico
and French.
No, Spanish American.
Spanish American?
War.
War
Yeah.
and
Mexican
Mexican
American
American War.
War.
Mhm.
There's one more.
War of
Civil War.
1812.
Well, we mentioned Civil War, but yeah, War of 1812. Okay. Well, just remember, you only need one, so you just have to get one of them. So congratulations. So once again, the War of 1812, Mexican American. The Civil War might be the easiest answer because there are many Civil War questions on the test. Okay. Let's continue. So once again, what territory did the United States buy from France in 1803? What was the name of that territory?
Louisiana.
Louisiana.
That's right, the Louisiana Territory. Now, we call it the Louisiana Purchase, but actually the question mentions territory. So if you said Louisiana, you probably would be okay. Okay, now that was a lot of discussion just for two questions, I know, but I think it's important for students to know a little bit more about American history. So I think it's always good to learn a little bit more. Okay, now speaking of history, here is the biggest topic that is involved in the interview, and that is the Civil War. So that's what we're going to spend the next few minutes talking about. Now, guys, there's a lot of information here that we're going to talk about. So keep in mind there aren't many questions, but this is the one that has the most questions in the list of 100 questions. So let's go ahead and jump into the Civil War. Okay. Now, again, as we mentioned, the country was growing and growing and growing during the 1800s. So again, I'm going to read a little bit, and then again, I'm going to get you guys to help me. And in fact, I'm not even going to read everything you see here. But for example, I wanted to have you notice that from 1800 to 1860, we added 17 new states to the 13 that we had originally. So by the 1860s, we already had 30 states. So again, the country continued to grow. It grew because of these wars. It grew because of the Louisiana Purchase. And of course, we also had many immigrants coming to the United States. Now, originally, of course, they were the English. So remember, many weeks ago, we talked about the Pilgrims. But we also had many people from Scotland, from Ireland, right? Italy, and Western European countries. Germany eventually became a big country that people came from. So guys, for example, Cincinnati, you know that Ohio and Cincinnati had lots of Germans living here, living in Columbus, living in Cincinnati, living in Louisville. In fact, Cincinnati, we used to pronounce Cincinnati with a Z, Cincinnati. So in this case, a lot of German immigrants living here. So again, in the mid 1800s, here's a surprise for you. Cincinnati was the 4th largest city in the United States. That's a surprise, isn't it? Today, we don't think of Cincinnati as a big city, but in the 1820s and 1830s, Cincinnati was a big city. In fact, it was bigger than Chicago for a little while because of all of these people immigrating and moving to this area. But as the country continued to grow, we started having some problems. And this is one of the things that we're going to talk about here now. So as the country continued to expand, generally, and it's not the best way to explain it, but generally the country had two main sort of divisions. We had the northern states, right? So guys, when you think of the Ohio River here in Kentucky, think of the northern states as those states that are kind of north of the Ohio, okay? And then we have the South or the southern states. Now, Kentucky is often included when we talk about the northern states. But again, Kentucky is a little bit different, and we'll explain why in just a few minutes. So again, when we think about those states in the South, we're really thinking about Tennessee and so on. Now, what's interesting is as the country continued to grow, it really became a question of economy. How did people make money? Well, again, people moved into the earlier part. So let's look at this map down here. When people first came to the New World here in now the United States, most people came in the northern parts first. And when they came into the northern part, after 20, 30, 40 years, they started moving in western direction. So for example, many people who came to Ohio, especially in the northern parts of Ohio, uh, might might have come from Massachusetts or Pennsylvania, for example. Now, on the other hand, these middle colonies, we call them in the beginning the middle colonies here. So for example, Virginia, New York was probably more of a middle colony. Okay, these areas here. When people came into the middle colonies, and I'll use a different color here, many of these people came not necessarily for religious reasons. Remember, we talked about the Pilgrims coming for more religious freedom. But actually, as people started coming into the middle colonies and then later into the southern colonies, they came for different reasons. They came mostly for economic opportunities. Uh, Keep in mind, when these people were coming, these people were very, very poor, or often they were coming from the king. The king, for example, if you notice the names of some of these colonies, Virginia, North Carolina, these particular names were much more reflecting the British sort of economy. Well, they came in fact, there's Georgia. If you see Georgia, Georgia is for King George. That's where the name comes from. Well, when many of these people came into the United States, they wanted land. They wanted to grow. They wanted to grow tobacco, for example. Tobacco, of course, was very popular among the Native Americans. And some of you remember Columbus, right? Columbus Day was Monday. Um, but when Columbus came, he was introduced to tobacco, and many of the first people who came to this part of the world also discovered tobacco. So as they continued to move into this part of the world, uh, they wanted more land, economic opportunity, and of course, the opportunity to trade with England and with Europe. So as the country continued to grow, we started seeing a lot of these kind of cultural differences, religious differences, and of course, economic differences. The North, for example, let's use a different color there for just a moment. So the North, this part here, okay, had more people, lots more people, because obviously people came here first. And big cities like New York and Boston, and of course eventually Philadelphia, this is where people began to, work, began to do things, and build, eventually factories. But in the South, again, using our colors here, but when we think about the South and the middle colonies, these places were much more farming, much more farming. And as you know, being a farmer, you don't make a lot of money being a farm and working on a farm. So again, this began part of the problem here in the United States. And of course, another problem is who's going to work on these farms. Often, many of these farms did not have a lot of people. So of course, that's when slaves became part of the story of American history. Now remember, slaves, well, many other countries, many other places, places like Mexico and places like South America and places in the like Haiti and the Dominican Republic, they imported slaves too. In fact, in Brazil, they kept slaves for a long time. They imported people from Africa for a long time. But same thing with the United States. The United States brought in many slaves, many, many slaves from Africa. So that became a big problem too, because eventually many of those slaves, they were used in the South. Now, of course, there were slaves in the North too, but over time, people in the North, they didn't want slaves anymore, or at least they didn't necessarily agree with slavery. So we'll talk about that in just a moment. Now, I'm sorry we had to draw so many things on the screen here, but as you can see, America in 1864 compared to the America of 1803 or even before, America was growing very quickly, and that was causing some problems. Now, if you notice here on the map, okay, so if you notice the colors, notice the dark blue represented those northern states, those states that eventually said, we think slavery is wrong. The border states here in this light blue color, so for example, Missouri, Kentucky, eventually West Virginia. Okay, so that's, in the beginning there was no West Virginia. Maryland, Delaware. These places were what we call the border states. That means they were between the North and the South, but they did not actually kind of fight in the Civil War. Now, keep in mind, a place like Kentucky, this is why Kentucky is a little different, is a little difficult to talk about, because in Kentucky, people, slavery was legal. People could have slaves in Kentucky, but Kentucky did not actually fight in the Civil War. So that's something we're going to talk about here in just a moment. And then finally, if you notice the strange little pictures here, these were territories that were not states. So again, many of these places were not states at the time. So Utah was not a state, Arizona, New Mexico. So these places were not states. They were territories of the United States. So once again, we had this interesting sort of divide, this separation in culture, in economy, in many different ways. So that became the problem. And as the country continued to grow, the real problem was which particular economy, which particular ideas were going to win. Were we going to continue to allow slavery and permit slavery? Many people said that's not acceptable. We think slavery is wrong. Whereas people in the South, they said we need slaves for our economy. So again, it's more complicated than just that, but that was kind of the beginning. The idea is that they wanted, many of them did not want slaves to continue, and part of it too was also political power. Here in the United States in the 1800s, if you had slaves, slaves gave you more political power in Congress, in the government. So that became very difficult too. Okay, now guys, the Civil War is a very big topic. We could talk about the Civil War for months, for years. It's probably the most studied studied event here in American history. People have written more books about the Civil War, more everything, because it is such a complicated topic. Okay, now again, lots of stuff to talk about, but I think slavery is the one that we really need to address. So let's talk about that. I'm going to read this next one, and then I'm going to get you guys to help me with the next slides. So again, slavery was nothing new. Most cultures had slaves of some kind in history, but the truth is, here in the New World, in the United States, in Mexico, and other places, eventually, or South America, eventually slaves became people that were sold and bought in Africa. And so many of those African slaves eventually came to the New World. And again, it wasn't just America, but eventually countries like England, Spain, France, they stopped bringing slaves over long before the United States did. In fact, the United States continued to allow slavery up until the 1860s. In fact, in 1860, we had 4 million slaves living in the United States. So keep in mind, this was not an easy topic. And this is, again, this is the 1860s. So, the world was different in the 1800s. People's thinking was different. Of course, we think about slavery as something that's wrong, and it is wrong. But remember, a lot of people used slaves throughout the world. So the difficult part of discussing slavery is the fact that, yes, it was wrong, but it was a sort of an economic, people saw it as an economic issue too. So again, like we said, Americans did not agree about slavery. The North, many of the people in the North, they wanted to free slaves. They didn't like slavery. Now, let's remember something. They did not like slavery, but many people in the North didn't necessarily think that Africans were equal to people in America. So I think sometimes we forget that people in the North, they had different attitudes about slaves. They thought slavery was wrong, but many people did not want to accept Africans as equal to Americans. So that's a very difficult topic to talk about. Now in the South, of course, people needed slaves, wanted slaves to work on plantations. Plantations are like big, big farms. And in fact, tobacco was the first crop, but eventually it became cotton. Cotton became the big, big crop, and it became very, like a very good way to make money. It's an easy way to make money, a cheaper way than tobacco. But as you could grow cotton anywhere, you could grow cotton in any hot place. In Africa, for example, in Egypt, for example, you can grow cotton. You can grow cotton in many places around the world, right? Right, Saba?
Egypt is famous about cotton.
Yeah, so you could grow cotton in India. You could grow cotton in many places, as long as it's hot and wet. Well, that's like the South in the United States, very hot and wet. But cotton became the crop. In fact, many people called cotton king cotton, like the king, because it was basically the #1 crop. And so that's why slaves became, basically sort of cheaper to use on these particular plantations. Of course, they still cost money. I mean, buying and selling was still something that people needed money for. Now, keep in mind, again, 1800s, a very different world. Of course, we realize, long after that this was wrong. But as we said before, the past is a very different place. It's very difficult to talk about those things today. But the truth is, most of those slaves lived in the South. Now, there were some slaves that lived in the North, but the truth is most lived in the South, and they did not have any freedom. They were not considered to be people or citizens at this time. They had no schools, and they had no right to vote. So again, as you can see, very difficult topic, and it's still a topic that people do not want to talk about today. People do not agree on this issue here today. And again, as you can see, in the 1800s, 1860s, again, many African slaves had their own, they had houses or places to live in on the plantations, but they didn't have freedom. Many times, if they didn't even have the opportunity to marry legally. So oftentimes they would separate husbands and wives. They would separate children from their families. This was a terrible time in the United States. But again, it was part of the problem between the North and the South. The South said they needed slaves for their economy to survive. The North said, we think slavery is wrong. So again, as you can see, that was going to be a problem. That was going to continue to be a problem into the 1860s. Okay? Okay, let's see. So, Elena, would you like to help us with this next slide? I'm going to zoom in. Okay, so Elena, would you like to read this next part here?
Yes, I would like. The South was agriculture.
Good.
The population was 9 million people. The South had small farms and big plantations. They grow cotton, tobacco, corn, sugar, and rice. Most slaves lived on big plantations.
Plantations. There you go.
Plantations. Many South.
It's a hard one. Southerners.
Southerners.
Yeah.
Many Southerners wanted flavor. The South wanted strong states' rights. States' rights means the states decide their government. The South wanted to separate from the United States. The South made a new country, the Confederate States of America. Confederate.
Good.
Robert I. Lee was the military leader. Jefferson Davis was the president of the Confederate States.
All right, excellent job, Elena. Okay, now, so then just to kind of review, so again, the South eventually decided in 1861 that we were going to separate from the United States. Again, now it seems like we've jumped a lot of history here, but the truth is we had many fights, many battles. Again, we could take weeks to talk about the Civil War. We don't have weeks. But the truth is, we already had people fighting because of this issue. So in 1860, President Lincoln, right, he became president. And by the way, where was Abraham Lincoln born? Does anybody know?
Kentucky? No.
Congratulations! Abraham Lincoln was born here in Kentucky. If you go to Covington and you go to the library in Covington, you will see a big statue of Abraham Lincoln. That's because he was born here. Now, here's a big surprise. You ready for a big surprise?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, here's another surprise. Do you see this picture down here? This is Jefferson Davis. Jefferson Davis became the president of that new country, the Confederate States of America. Well, here's the big surprise. He was from Kentucky too. Both of the presidents at this time came from Kentucky. Abraham Lincoln was born here. Jefferson Davis was born in Western Kentucky. Now, of course, if you can think about it at the time, President Lincoln did not want slavery. Well, that was going to be a problem. So in 1861, the South decided to separate. They decided to vote and have their own new country, and they called it the Confederate States of America. And they chose Jefferson Davis to be their president. So believe it or not, the president of the North and the president of the South were both from Kentucky. So the idea here is the South, very agricultural. Again, we mentioned not a big population. All right, let's go on to the North now. All right, Elaine, would you like to read this one for us?
Yes.
Okay, so I'll pull up the North there. Tell us about the North.
The North was industrial.
Industrial,
Industrial. The population was 21 million people. The North have factories, railroad, and ports.
Good.
They
Produced.
produce paper, glass,
Textiles.
and what?
Metal products. Yeah, like for example, guns and bullets. Textiles and textiles is referring to like clothes,
Yeah.
So as you can see, they depended on the South for their cotton. So, okay, please continue.
From 1840 to 1860, 4 million immigrants arrived here. Many immigrants worked in the factories. Many
Northerners
did not want
slavery.
The North wants the country to stay together.
Now, this is a big name here. Ulysses S. Grant.
Ulysses S. Grant was the
Military
leader.
Good. All right, what about this last one? You got to read this last one.
Lincoln
There you go.
Was the president of the United States.
Yeah, and like we said before, Lincoln, we got to know how to read that one, right? Now, Ulysses S. Grant is the person you see here. Thank you, Elaine. Thank you for reading that. Now, first off, guys, Ulysses S. Grant was born in Ohio. You can visit his house where he lived in Ohio. He's very close to here, about 45 minutes away. He actually became president later after the Civil War. Now, another interesting Kentucky connection, I believe his uncle was the leader of a church in Covington. So if you go to Covington, there's a little sign that says Ulysses S. Grant's uncle worked in Covington. So again, a lot of Kentucky, Ohio connections to the Civil War. And that's because Kentucky was a border state. Kentucky was the separation between the free North, right, and the Southern South, the slave-owning South. So Kentucky was a big part. So Saba, that's why we have Fort Mitchell, Fort Thomas, right? Fort
Wright.
Yeah, Fort Wright, because these were forts built during the Civil War, and they were built to fight against people from the South coming into Cincinnati. So that's why we still have those names today, Fort Thomas and so on. Okay, so again, let's compare. So as we said before, the population was 21 million. That was much bigger than the South, right? The South had 9 million. Again, the North, industrial, right? The South was agricultural. So again, we had big differences here. And again, eventually the problem was President Lincoln said, we are not going to separate as a country. We're going to stay together. And if we have to fight, we will fight to stay together. Now, guys, you could take 10 people, talk to 10 Americans, and maybe get 5 different opinions. But the truth is, slavery was the main cause of the Civil War. But there were economic issues too. There were political issues. So it's not so easy. It's not an easy answer as to why the Civil War happened. But slavery was pretty much the #1 reason. But again, there were many other complicated things. Okay, now I'm going to continue here with this next part, just real quickly, because again, I know our time is up here. So for example, we mentioned already some of those particular problems: slavery, economic reasons, but even the issue of states' rights. Again, people in the South, they wanted states to decide if we should have slaves or not. People in the North said, no, we should be one government, one country with one idea, and that is slaves should be free. So again, the Civil War lasted for about 4 years, 1861, and ended in 1865. The South eventually surrendered. They eventually said, we quit. We know we're going to lose this war. But guys, this war was terrible for the country. Terrible, terrible. And as you can see, when you think about how many people have died, 620,000 people died in the war. Now, at the time, the population of the United States was not that big. Not that big at all. So in this case, that was a very large percentage. In fact, most people guess that pretty much every family had at least one member either die or they knew somebody who died in the Civil War. So as you can see, that was a very terrible time in the United States history. And like we said before, there were many changes after the war. Again, I wish we had more time to talk about them, but as you can see, the Civil War is a huge, big idea, big topic, and I'm sure all of you in your countries, you have historical moments, historical events that would take a very long time to talk about. But guys, the Civil War affected everything about American life, everything. It changed so much about how America was going to be into the 1900s. So again, lots of things to kind of talk about. Okay, Saba, would you like to read this part for us? So now, during the war, one of the issues was what to do with slaves when the war was finished. So let's learn a little bit about this freedom for slaves. So Saba, would you read this part for us?
Okay. Freedom for slaves in America. In 1863, Lincoln wrote the
Emancipation.
Emancipation Proclamation.
Good.
The Emancipation Proclamation freed slaves in the South. After the war, there were many changes for Black people. In 1865, the slaves were freed in every state of the United States. In 1868, Black people got U.S. citizenship. In 1870, Black men got the right to vote.
Okay, thank you. Now, everybody turn on your microphones. Everybody turn on your microphones.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, now guys, we're going to say this together because this is one of the questions that you might hear. So let's say this expression, let's say this again together. Emancipation, everybody. Emancipation Proclamation. Okay, now the Emancipation Proclamation, everyone let's say it. Freed the slaves.
Freed the slaves.
Freed slaves.
Okay, all right. Okay, guys, you can turn off your mics for a moment. Okay, now here's the truth. It didn't actually free them at the moment. Basically, the problem was 1863, the war was still going on. So Abraham Lincoln thought it would be a good idea to give this extra sort of inspiration. How can we win this war? You see, the North had more people. The North had more money. bigger military. Many people thought the war would be finished in, a year, maybe 6 months. No, the South, they were determined. They were going to fight and fight. So by 1863, the war was not going very well for the North. So Abraham Lincoln thought, well, if we free the slaves, perhaps they will help join in this war. Now, of course, the problem is the South did not recognize this as a legal document. So even though President Lincoln wrote the Emancipation Proclamation to free the slaves, they didn't actually become free until the war was finished. But on the interview, that is one of the questions. The Emancipation Proclamation freed the slaves. So keep in mind that eventually, yes, after the war, they did become free. In 1865, okay, and then later with some changes to the Constitution. Remember, what do we call a change to the Constitution? Who can remember? What's that word called when we change the Constitution? Anybody remember?
Amendments?
Congratulations, Elena. You win the prize. Yes, so there were actually many amendments passed after the Civil War, and many of those amendments were to give black people the right to vote, the right to be a citizen. They were not even citizens yet. So the truth is, the 13th Amendment freed them. The 14th Amendment gave them citizenship and equal protection, and then the 15th Amendment gave them the right to vote. Now, Saba, you will notice something. Notice it says black men had the right to vote. You might remember we talked about in one of our classes that women did not get the right to vote.
Yes.
Until when? Do you remember?
It's 19.
This is the 100th anniversary.
Yes. It's 1920.
Congratulations. All right, Saba. So guys, women, of course, did not get the right to vote. Any women did not get the right to vote until 1920. But so in this case, black men got the right to vote in 1870. And in fact, some of the women at the time, they were not happy. They're like, what about us? We deserve to vote too. Okay. All right, well, we'll skip this last activity here. So, all right, guys, now, as you can see, lots of information. The Civil War is a very interesting topic. My father-in-law, he loved studying about the Civil War. He really likes a lot of that. But let's go ahead and answer some questions. Okay, so guys, here we go. Can you name the U.S. war between the North and the South? What is the name of that war?
Civil War? No.
Congratulations. Now, you could also say, believe it or not, you could also say the war between the states. Some people still accept that as the name, the war between the states. In fact, some people think that's a better name than the Civil War, because the truth is, usually civil wars fight over the capital. But this did not happen at this time. Both countries had different capitals. So it might be better to call it the war between the states. But again, the Civil War is what most people call it. Okay, guys, what was one important thing that Abraham Lincoln did? We talked about it just a moment ago.
Freedom slaves.
Congratulations. And he wrote an important document. What was the document? The Emancipation Proclamation. Congratulations. Now, guys, this is my feeling. This is just my opinion. I think Abraham Lincoln needs more questions because I think Abraham Lincoln was probably the best president in American history. But we only get one question with his name. So here you go. Here are three possible answers. Freed the slaves, wrote the Emancipation Proclamation, saved or preserved the country, the Union, so we call it the Union, and he led the United States during the Civil War. Okay, now, once again, can we name one problem that led to the Civil War? We mentioned three. Of course, we mentioned one was probably the most important. What was one problem that led to the Civil War?
Different
economic reasons. Saba, can you think of another one?
Slavery.
Yeah, I think that's number one. And then, so we mentioned slavery, economic reasons, of course, and you could also mention states' rights. Yeah. Okay. Now again, I think slavery is probably the best answer to the question. Okay, and what did the Emancipation Proclamation do?
slaver?
Freed the slaves.
Freed the slaves. And of course, you could answer it many different ways. Freed slaves, freed the slaves in the Confederacy, freed slaves in the Confederate States, or in most southern states. Now remember, of course, it didn't actually do it at the moment, but the truth is it helped lead to that idea at the end of the war. Okay, now guys, we're going to stop here for today. I'm sorry we didn't have time to do some writing practice. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to make a short extra video where you can practice a little bit more at home. But the idea is you're going to get some other writing practice that you can try. So we're going to skip this last part because our time is up. It's too hard when we have too much information, right? Too much stuff. Okay, well guys, so this week I'm going to send to you in your email the flashcard practice for this part of American history, the 1800s, including the Civil War. And like I said before, I will send to you some extra writing practice because we always need more writing practice, right? We need it to help us do well on this part of the test.